Hi there, this is Solitary Ronan from Solitary Ronan Films, and welcome to another episode of Double Take. Today I'm going to look at two Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid films. The 1969 George Roy Hill film starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford, you've probably heard of them, and Richard Lester's 1979 film Butch Cassidy and Sundance, the early years. This is a Spanish Blu-ray. I'm not actually sure it's available on a US Blu-ray or not. Obviously one of these films is really celebrated and the other one isn't really talked about. Obviously Richard Lester has done this before as far as taking familiar characters and perhaps showing a different side of them that nobody else would try. Apparently he claimed that he'd never seen the Paul Newman Robert Redford film. I mean, obviously Richard Lester did the best Three Musketeers films, going back to the actual book and making it a bit more not necessarily realistic, but a bit more faithful to the book. Then of course he did, in my opinion, the best Robin Hood film, and of course this is Robin Hood nearing retirement, dealing with old age, dealing with the weight of being a legend, and the weight of the myth making, and this is an absolute masterpiece, and again for me it's the best Robin Hood film. So really, I mean, Lester wouldn't be daunted by doing the prequel to what is known as a Hollywood classic. I'm not a huge fan of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I do actually prefer the Lester film, because when you think about it, what is the 1969 film remembered for? It's remembered for Burt Bacharach's Raindrops Keep Falling in My Head, the riding a bicycle scene, the jumping in the river scene, and of course the ending with the freeze frame, which at the time I first saw it, it's kind of, well, maybe it's to protect the innocent from the Wild Bunch type shootout, which was obviously released in 1969 as well. Two slightly different views of the Western, but in actual fact the bodies of Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid may not have been the actual bodies. The graves were exhumed in 1991 apparently, and they did DNA testing, and the DNA didn't really match anything belonging to a Cassidy or a Sundance. Obviously that wasn't the real names. Robert Leroy Parker was Butch Cassidy, and Harry Alonzo Longbaugh was the Sundance Kid, but obviously having films with those names in the title is a bit much. They're kind of famous for not killing people, even though Sundance did kill at least one person, and certainly both these films are kind of light-hearted looks at the West. They're almost kind of a little bit like Robin Hood, you know, they didn't kill people, they didn't steal as much as they could have. There is a lightness to them, and again, certainly with the 69 film, there is a wonderful juxtaposition between that and the Wild Bunch, both in the same year. Also the Wild Bunch with took American cinematic violence along with Bonnie and Clyde by Arthur Penn to the next level, in some ways kind of ending, obviously signifying the end of the West in the film, but also the end of the Western as a popular kind of film genre for studios to make. And then you have Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with its comic touch. It's almost known more as a romance film rather than an actual Western. I mean, nobody really has this in their top 10 Westerns of all time. Well, maybe some people do, but not necessarily people who perhaps have a kind of wider view of the Western in totality. I mean, the 69 film is enjoyable enough, but it is almost like light fluff. It does star two legends along with Catherine Ross, but I do think the Lester film did a tremendous job with the casting. William Katt as the Sundance Kid, who I didn't realise, but he was kind of known as the young Robert Redford. Obviously his career never really panned out, and Tom Berenger still has that kind of enthusiasm, even though he might not be as smart as he claims he is, as Butch Cassidy, which is the same kind of element that Paul Newman brought to the film. Obviously the box office is somewhat different. The George Roy Hill film made 102 million. The Richard Lester film, I believe, made 5 million on a $9 million budget. And I've never run a studio before, or never ran a studio before, but I don't think that's good business if you're making films to lose 4 million. I did look up a quote by a Fox executive, or an ex-Fox executive, who said that the Richard Lester film was a parody of a satire filmed by talentless people. I certainly wouldn't go that far. As I said, I actually prefer the 79 film to the 69 film, the same way that I obviously prefer Richard Lester's Musketeers films, and I prefer Richard Lester's Robin Hood film, Robin and Marion. Both films, according to Letterboxd, are both 111 minutes, which is kind of bizarre. They both feel perhaps a little bit longer than that, especially the 69 film. My perception of the 69 film was that it was like well over 2 hours. And again, if you take out those kind of famous scenes, it's like, what do people actually remember about the 69 film? But again, to be fair, the Richard Lester one at 111 minutes is probably a little too long as well. But there's good stuff in it. There's a nice scene involving a skunk. There's some nice scenes with snow gliding shoes. You might recognise them as skis. And I like the kind of town where Butch Cassidy, under his normal name, has a wife and children. It's a very religious background, and he's a butcher, strange enough, that's how he got his name. And his Bible quotes kind of painted on the hillsides, and which is a nice little Richard Lester type touch. I mean, both films again have this gaiety about them, have this kind of light touch, despite the fact they're dealing with criminals. But it's not the kind of gritty spaghetti western that obviously in 1969 and by the time of 1979 lots of us had seen. Well, obviously not at the time for my age, but obviously we've seen enough spaghetti westerns now that almost these two films could be seen as quite jarring as examples of westerns, because they are definitely a little bit of comic westerns. There is one actor that appears in both films, and that's Jeff Corey, who again, you might not recognise the name, but you'll certainly recognise the face. He plays the Sheriff Bledsoe in both films. But interestingly, Peter Weller is in the early years, Christopher Lloyd and Brian Dennehy. Strangely enough, Brian Dennehy in 1979 looks exactly like Brian Dennehy in like 2012. He cuts a fine figure as one of the antagonists to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So I mean, both films, you might argue that neither of these films are going to end up on the Sight and Sound 250 list, but for me it's an example of perhaps a little overrated classic not actually being as good as its kind of underrated and belittled prequel that came 10 years later. But please tell me in the comments which version of the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. I mean, obviously with prequels, for example, there's no real threat, even though they do get injured in one way or another. There's no real threat. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid aren't going to die in the prequel. But then you could answer, did they actually die at the end of the film in Bolivia, the 1969 film? They could be like Jack the Ripper, still living today, even though they'd be quite old. So thanks very much for watching this episode of Double Take on Butch and Sundance. Again, you can let me know which one you prefer in the comments, and hopefully you'll join me again for more episodes of Double Take. This is Solitude Ronan from Solitude Ronan Films, saying farewell.